And good morning, everybody, or good afternoon or evening, depending where you're at. My name is Nicholas Whitaker. I am the Media Outreach Manager on the News Lab at Google. This is our third out of seven AMP office hours. We have a really fantastic lineup of guests today to talk a little bit about AMP, which we'll get into introducing them in a minute. But before we get into that, I just wanted to give you a brief overview of what the News Lab is and what we do. You can find more out about our organization at g.co/newslab, where you'll find not only information on our team and the programs that we work with, but also tutorials on a wide range of topics, including many different Google tools. These office hours and the questions that come from these will lead up to a series of training tutorials around AMP as well. So if you have additional questions or if you have additional information that you're trying to find out about AMP, we'll be providing resources for all of that in a variety of different formats, and we'll talk more about those links later on. We have as a guest today Stacy Chan, who is working with us on AMP. Stacy, would you like to introduce our guests today?
Yes. Thanks, Nick, so much. Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. Really excited to have our third installment, as Nick said. My name is Stacy Chan. I work with the Google Search and News teams, and delighted. His presentation is going to be incredible. You're going to learn so much more about AMP. He's our lead AMP engineer, Malte Ubl, and there are very excited guests on this Hangout as well. From WordPress, we've got Paul Majorana. Paul, give a wave. We've got Julie Westphal from the LA Times. Hi, Julie. And we've got Dennis Pinsky, Jason Jean, and Lauren Lee from Forbes. I guess Forbes rolls deep. So they're all excited to be here as well. And so guests, if you have questions for Malte at any time, feel free to ask. This is a very informal conversation. Folks watching at home or in their newsrooms, Nick is vigilantly watching our comment section on the G+ page, so go ahead and ask your questions there. So Malte, please take it away.
All right. Start the screen sharing. And so my talk is titled AMP's Anatomy, because I'm going to kind of dive deep into how AMP achieves kind of the speed that you're hopefully seeing in the wild. Again, my name is Malte. I have the weird internet handle Cramforce, and I'm the tech lead of AMP. So basically, everything you don't like about it on a technical point of view is my fault. And since you're on GitHub, you can fix it or you can file issues there. So we do everything better. So the way I'd like to explain how we see AMP is that web performance is somewhat difficult, but you can hand-tune sites, and then they get really fast, right? And AMP can't really be that fast. So if you're a web performance expert, you're going to be better than us. But we're aiming to be right there in the front of the race with AMP. And unfortunately, we're seeing the average mobile site way back there, really slow. And the goal of AMP is to have everyone kind of have the same speed, like everyone be up there with very little variance, so users have a really uniform, fast experience. And if you follow web performance and how Google talks about it, there's this concept of rail, which we can later link to. And basically, we see AMP as kind of this fast track, clear guidance to how you achieve the principles of rail. Now, basically, there's these guidelines. AMP documents should always be fast. So there's this promise of AMP that if you follow what AMP does, it's going to be fast. And the other point is that AMP documents are only valid if they do not contain things that might be slow. And there's this might in here, so we can't always be sure. There's some things you might be able to get fast if you really tune it, but we have to be a bit more conservative. So there's this validator that tells you this cannot be in the page because we cannot guarantee it's going to be fast. And what that means is there's some of these things that you can't have, and that's kind of sad. Because there's nice things in the web platform that aren't immediately available or have to be done in AMP in a special way. But there's all these docs that help you do it. But that's kind of the trade-off that we're having here. What I'm going to do next is go through 10 optimizations where I say that AMP's documents cannot not have. So you can put them in every web document, but if you have a valid AMP document, you will have these optimizations. And so the first one, I think, is pretty straightforward, and I think that's one of the most common best practices, that you're saying all scripts in a page have to be async. Now, if you've ever tried to actually achieve that, it's actually really hard to get a page to this state. But AMP is carefully designed around principles that make this possible. And what that in practice means is that you have this async attribute in all scripts. And so something actually really hard to do with outside of AMP, not impossible, but not easy. But in AMP, it's really straightforward, and you have to do it. The second one, which is actually my favorite principle, is what we call static resource sizing. What that means, and this is an example from The Guardian, is kind of this best practice from like 1994. In the web, you can put an image on a page, but if you tell it up front how big it will be, the browser can like draw a box and doesn't have to like download the resource to figure out how big it will be. And for AMP, we basically took this principle and applied it to everything. So for example, ads and iframes all follow the same rules around sizing, so we can draw boxes for them before having the actual content. And that makes the user experience much better because you don't have this effect of a page kind of incrementally building up. When I see static resource sizing, that does not mean that the page cannot be responsive. So all we require is that you give us the aspect ratio of the image, for example, so we can figure out the box given the actual responsive screen size that we're currently seeing. But basically, you only have to give the aspect ratio. But that's an important part. Kind of skip over these here. I think I explained this pretty good. Second is there's this concept of extended components. So for example, if you want to put a tweet on a page, you have to say specifically, I want to support tweets, and AMP downloads the right code for it. And they don't block page layout. So while these extensions have to like download some more code, AMP can actually draw their box without knowing, for example, in this case, what an iframe is, right? So long before everything on a page comes together, you have this complete page layout that only has these boxes that need to be filled in. And users really like that, because for users it means I understand it's still loading, but at least I kind of have an understanding how this page works. One very important kind of best practice is that fonts in web pages are very, very, very hard to get fast. And one thing you need to understand, and that's actually really intuitive, I had to learn this too, is that we got, as web developers, we learned about the preload scanner, which is really good at like downloading images on the page way before browser actually gets to render them. But it's different for fonts, because fonts are so big, browsers are conservative and say, I actually want to see what's on the page actually gets rendered. Maybe your CSS like kind of hides it until I actually even go and fetch the font. And that leads to the fonts, which are themselves really big, being downloaded very late, which is even worse for performance. And so AMP is carefully designed to have exactly one HTTP request that has to be downloaded to download all the fonts, which is a massive performance boost. Next thing I want to talk about is that third-party JavaScript, like you need for ads and you need for tweets and for Instagrams and for Facebook posts and all these things, your comments, there's lots of stuff like that. You can have them in AMP, well supported, but they're sandboxed in iframes. And what that means is it's first of all good for security, but it's also really good for performance, because the problem with third-party JavaScript is it tends to do stuff that might be okay when considered in like by themselves, but like when you put them all together, they get really slow. And so in AMP, that gets kind of put in its own sandbox and cannot affect the performance on the web page. Basically, each of these iframes is kind of responsible for their own destiny, and if they don't load, the plugin is missing, but the page is still fully usable. The most important benefit of this is that you've probably heard, if you care about web performance, you heard about document write, which is the worst thing you can do to a web page. But unfortunately, especially in the ads world, it's very common. And so because we couldn't get rid of it, but we banned them in iframes, one thing that's important is that document writes in iframes don't block the outer page. And so what you get is that the ad might do this like worst practice from 1999, where there was no other option to do it. And the ad is slow, but your page is fast, right? And that's much better than everything being slow. It's still not great that the ad is slow, but it's, at least the page is fast. So that's like very, very important. Next point, CSS portion control. So the thing about CSS is that it tends to eventually get really big. For every for every complex site, you eventually have so much of it. And so we decided we would limit how much CSS you can have in a single AMP page. And the limit at 50 kilobytes is actually enough to do basically whatever you want. Like it's a bunch of CSS, and you can style whatever you want, but it's not enough to not care about the size. So it's kind of a hygiene requirement. Everyone needs to basically take care that they know what CSS they actually have on a page and only use the stuff that they actually need. Yeah, I think I talked about this before. Fonts start downloading really fast. Don't have to spend too much time on this. They're super large, and in AMP, they're well supported, and they should be faster than you see on a normal web page. And by the way, there's this, what web developers would call atrocity in AMP. So we hide the body first, and then when fonts come in, we unhide it. But that enables us to kind of have this first pass where the fonts gets matched, but the page isn't quite ready yet. And one of the nice things is that there's a problem. The page stays blank if JavaScript times out. But good news is there's actually a fix for this coming up, which is using a CSS animation to simulate kind of a timeout. So we kind of worked around that and get the best of all worlds and really fast font performance. Another thing you might have heard about in the world of web performance is style recalculations. And so this is something, especially if you have lots of third-party JavaScript, that's really, really hard to get right. What AMP tries to do is to minimize the number of style recalculations on a page. And there's several strategies, and I think the next slide kind of illustrate what happens. So the way these style recalculations, which is basically the browser saying, I really need to recalculate the page, and that takes a long time, is that you can easily get into these patterns where you say, I need to measure this, and then I'm setting the height of something, then I need to measure something again because I need it from my other program, and then I maybe set some other height, and then I measure the height again. And what happens then is that you get these 3 style recalculations. So the browser 3 times has to do this work, which is really expensive. And what we do in AMP is we automatically reorder our accesses to the document object model, so the way the browser represents the web page internally, so that all the reads and all the writes are bundled, so that we only have a read first, which is based on a single style recalculation, and then as a follow-up, we do all the writes. So we invalidate while not checking again what happened. And so with AMP, you get about 2 style recalculations during typical page load. This is extremely hard to achieve in a generic web page. The next point is that AMP mandates that you can only use animations that are GPU optimizable. So what this means is your devices, they have these GPUs, graphics processing units, which are specialized chips that know how to animate things. But they don't necessarily know how to draw a web page. So they have limitations in what they can do. And they, for example, if you have this layer of stuff, you can move it around. You can you can do animations like that. You can scale it. You can change its opacity so it gets translucent, because these are operations that kind of what we call invariant to page layout. So this special processor on your phone can do it really, really quickly. And essentially, that's the only way how to do fast animations, especially on slow mobile devices. And so what that means is in AMP, when you're animating or transitioning something, you limit it to transform and opacity. Again, this is kind of AMP mandates this. I would actually advise you, if you have a non-AMP page, to limit yourself to the same thing. Because, for example, if you're animating the width of something, the browser has to calculate the size of the unit on every frame. It's just going to be super janky. But that's the point, right? You can't, sometimes you want to animate the widths. You're not allowed to in AMP, but you really shouldn't, because there's just no way in a web browser to actually make it look good in practice. And it doesn't count that it looks good on your like $2,500 MacBook Pro. It has to look good on a crappy phone from like 2 years ago. Almost last point, resource prioritization. So browsers in general don't know much about a web page. They might load Gmail or like the Google homepage or your blog. And they don't know the difference really, and they have to use the same strategy. But AMP is designed for content, and so we know there's this thing about the fold, right? And the stuff about the fold is more important right now than everything else. And so AMP really like optimizes for getting that stuff that you're currently seeing rendered as fast as possible, and kind of put everything else on a lower priority. Obviously, we try to get stuff in as fast as possible, but we look at that first viewport and download that first. And the last thing I want to talk about is instant loading. So you've seen that possibly in our demo, where you basically have a search result, and you tap it, and it's like the result just more animates in, so there's no loading at all, right? So this is instant effect. And I want to explain how that works. So browsers have this thing called link rel pre-render. And actually only Chrome supports this. And that's been around for a while, but it comes with problems. And the problems is if you pre-render a page, so you render it before the user wants it, it might do all this stuff. So it might like do animation, and it might load ads, and the ads might like do animations. And so you can't really control what they do, and it takes up a lot of bandwidth. So that's really an efficient way to do this. So what AMP is doing is it's using the same technique of pre-rendering. So when you, in Google's example, when you tap the search result, the page is already rendered. That's why it's so fast, and it's, you know, I call it cheating, but it's cheating in a good way, because you get this completely instant performance, where since it's already there, right? So the work's been done already while you were like selecting the search results. So we used the time that the person needed to kind of figure out what the previous page did to like anticipate what they'll do next and already do the work. And so AMP has two very important optimizations for pre-rendering, and that's, I think, I said earlier, many of these things you can do on a non-AMP page if you really want to. This is something that's really unique to AMP. So you can tell an AMP page, you're in pre-render mode. You're not actually being shown to anyone yet. We'll show you later, but not yet. And so what AMP will do, it will say, I will only download stuff that's above the fold, that's in the first viewport, nothing else, so that when the page is shown, it looks complete, but it's actually not. And but because humans are kind of slow, they're like, oh, the page is done. I'm happy. I'm a very happy user. Yay. And while you're having these like happy feelings, AMP is going, oh, I have to download everything else. But that's plenty of time, because reaction time is like 2 seconds. Like you get you have plenty of time to load the rest of the article and get really fast performance. And the other thing is, and that's actually a bonus for both privacy and performance, is that in this pre-render mode, AMP will not execute any third-party JavaScript. So all the ads, all iframes, all YouTube videos, all tweets, all Instagrams, all this stuff will not actually be loaded at this time. And the most important thing is that kind of takes away the CPU these would be needing, so the power of your phone. And so it's much cheaper to render this page. And that's why I call this like this sale for pre-rendering. So in AMP, basically, you get roughly 75 less cost for pre-rendering. And that cost is both in CPU terms, so the processor on your device, and bandwidth. Because obviously, if you only download the first viewport during pre-rendering, there's many things on the page that you just don't download. So it's cheaper, and only when the user expresses intent that they actually want to see the page, you download the full thing. I realized I was pretty fast. I wrote this article, and I think we probably have a place where you can post this link later on. I can sit here for a while. This is an article that goes through kind of all of these points, and I think 19 overall, like 10 more, and explains how they work. And so that might be interesting to learn more about AMP or how you can optimize a non-AMP page. And that's all I have today. I'm excited to hear questions and answer them.
Malte, that was great. Thank you for that. We're definitely going to link to this URL in the event page for this particular Hangout, as well as in the YouTube URL afterwards. And just for folks who are tuning in now, definitely send us your questions. You can drop your questions or comments into the event page. You can find us at Plus Google News Lab on Google+. For those of you who will be watching this afterwards on YouTube, you can also add in your comments after the fact, and we'll get back to you in future events. You can find us at youtube.com/newslab@google. Anybody here in the audience anybody here in the actual Hangout like to ask Malte a few questions based on what he was just presenting? Don't all jump at once.
I do have one if the guests are still formulating their thoughts, because I actually got a sneak peek at the presentation, so I cheated a little bit. Malte, this was a great overview of something that's pretty technical, in my opinion, for non-technical folks. I really love the analogies that you used. For a lot of publishers watching, this might be a little intimidating, the amount of additional AMP markup, it seems, that they need to create AMP HTML files. Are there additional resources, or are you working with other CMS providers, hint, hint, Paul, to make this process a little easier for some of the smaller publishers to ultimately create AMP HTML files?
So I think there's not many dimensions to this question. So I think knowing how AMP works is really interesting. I think many people will find that interesting, but it's only interesting. You don't technically have to understand how it works to appreciate that it's fast. And I think what I said at the start of the presentation, because there's a validator, you get very clear guidance as to what you have to do to change your page to be AMP compliant and to be fast. And I think that's kind of one of the primary innovations, is that previously there were lots of blogs, articles, books written about this topic. But it wasn't giving you concrete things. These are the steps you need to do. And so I think the feedback we've been getting is that it's not all too hard to get to a pretty good state with AMP. But it really depends on your CMS setup. So obviously we do have WordPress here, and I think they probably have the easiest option right now to get into AMP. And I'm obviously hoping that more CMS vendors will follow, and yeah, so I think that's kind of obviously the main stumbling block. But even many obviously companies have their own in-house CMSs, and it should be a reasonable task. And so far the feedback we've been getting is that it definitely worked for people.
Great, Paul. I'm going to take that as your cue, representing WordPress, to talk about your partnership with the AMP project.
Yeah, we're really excited to be a launch partner and to have support for AMP for WordPress. I think it can be a little intimidating. WordPress is interesting in the sense that it is used by some of the biggest media companies on the web, folks like News Corp, Time Inc., CBS, Tribune, and of course they have the resources to go and build their own AMP formatted websites. But there are also many millions of bloggers, small businesses, medium-sized businesses that just don't necessarily have that technical expertise to go and adopt AMP and reformat their sites themselves. Excuse me. So we're actually building a plugin for WordPress. It's free, open source. Anybody can use it. If you're on our hosted platform, when we enable it, you'll just get it out of the box. You won't have to lift a finger to have AMP formatted articles on your site. And then for anybody else out there using the open source WordPress, they can go and install this plugin. And again, you're basically just a couple clicks away at that point from having really fast, great mobile user experience on your site without having to kind of familiarize yourself with the AMP framework and write any code to really do it.
That's great. Paul, how do I find this plugin?
So our plugin's on GitHub. We can, I'm sure, maybe post the link there in the follow-up notes. And I think it's interesting. WordPress is the most popular CMS on the web. About 25% of sites publish with WordPress, which is obviously a pretty massive number. So we're excited to see AMP come into existence, and what we see is kind of when WordPress embraces a modern technology, the web kind of just given the breadth of WordPress sites out there also really embrace a modern technology. So we're excited to have the plugin out there and to see millions of sites install the plugin and have AMP formatted pages.
Paul, I got a quick question for you too. A lot of news organizations that I work with around the country are just now switching on to WordPress. I'm going to quickly mute you here so I don't have an echo. A lot of people are switching onto WordPress right now. As they're getting up and running with WordPress, where does AMP kind of fall into this? Is this something that they should be talking about early in this process of getting up and running with WordPress? Are there individual people that, maybe this is a question for Malte as well, are there individual people that we should be pointing them towards?
Yeah, I mean, so for any customers that we work with, so I lead what we call our VIP business here at WordPress.com, which is our enterprise group, and of course for any of our customers, having wrote the plugin and produced the plugin ourselves, we're very happy to work with any of our customers if they have any kind of issues with it, and certainly on GitHub, we're open source is our DNA, so we're very happy to kind of respond to issues and work with the community if they have any feedback or kind of running into any trouble with the plugin. But I'd say again, the whole premise of our having built it is to alleviate any publishers, big or small, from having to go and do it themselves. So in terms of kind of like what's the right time to deploy AMP on their site or how they should be thinking about it, it really should be pretty painless. As simple as just clicking a button and turning it on. And then we've built in a bunch of tools for their developers, again, typically for larger media companies, to go in and customize the experience even further from there.
So the takeaway here is don't panic. There's information available, and it should be relatively easy for most people to get up and running with it.
That's exactly right.
All right. Other questions from the Hangout here?
Julie Westfall at the LA Times. I was wondering, I've been reading a little bit about this. I'm not totally caught up, but it sounds like some big ad networks have announced that they're moving towards AMP specifications. But I was wondering if you have any idea what the timeline is on that. Obviously, it would probably be different for different ad networks, but have you talked to them? Has there been communication about that?
So I don't have good timelines for like concrete networks, but so we've definitely been seeing an immense uptake on our open source GitHub project of ad networks basically coming in on a daily basis. And so I think there's just a lot of activity, and so obviously Google has announced their that we will send starting traffic from search end of February, and I think everyone's kind of aiming at that deadline.
And Julie, because this is a series of AMP Hangouts, we'll definitely have actually an entire Hangout devoted to talking ads with Craig DiNatale, who's the director of ads in AMP. So he'll probably be able to give a little bit more specific list of ad networks that are on board.
And that's going to be on, I believe, February 19th, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that's correct.
And actually, maybe this is a good opportunity just to mention that, again, we're going to be doing this every Friday coming up for the next 5 weeks or so. The next events coming up are specific to analytics, paywalls, ads, and format innovation. So if we haven't been able to answer your question in detail in this event, we will definitely be answering those questions in more detail in future events. While the folks online here are thinking about their next question, let's turn to some questions that we got from the Google Plus page. A lot of activity there. Thanks, first of all, Chris Andrews, for helping some of the other folks on the Google Plus page figure out where to put their questions. Let's see, we've got one question here from Chris. He says, for SEO purposes, is the regular page and the AMP page considered the same thing? As a simple example, if the regular page gets authority in incoming links, does that boost the AMP page position in the AMP carousel? And he's got a follow-up question to that, which I'll get into in a second. We get a lot of questions around SEO, more kind of generally speaking, but again, around AMP. What's the best place for people to check out information about how to optimize their pages so they're being well surfaced on search?
So I'd like to answer like the concrete question. So I mean, it's really hard. So I know nothing about search, but one of the rules in AMP is, which is generally something we would recommend, is that every AMP document needs to have a canonical link tag, and so it points back to that. If there is a non-AMP document, which is not required, but which we would expect for many of, especially the larger publisher, and everyone who currently has a website puts AMP next to it. There's this dual thing of an AMP page and non-AMP page, and so they point to each other. And so the mechanism in general is designed to have exactly the consequence that's being asked here in the question, right? So that they're essentially treated as one unity. That's obviously subject to them actually having the same content, right? Can't just say it's a canonical version. It's just has to be somewhat related. But so I think in general that's what's the goal behind this rule, that you have to have this canonical URL in the AMP document.
Thanks, Malte. And we actually covered this also in our previous Hangout on Air, our previous office hour. So if you have additional questions, you can kind of go a little bit deeper into that particular topic. We did unpack that in a little bit more detail there. Another question from Chris Andrews. He says, what is the best practice for handling comments? Is there a way to include them? Should a comment link go to another AMP page or the regular page? I think this is kind of a related question.
So for comments, I mean, there's various ways to include them in web pages. So many of the blog kind of / CMS systems have their own built-in support, and then there is companies that support third-party plugins for comments. And so in general, if you want to include them in your AMP document, that's possible. There's two ways. Currently, actually, although we have pretty deep support for many third-party things, there's no direct support for any comment systems in AMP, but AMP kind of has this escape hatch, I would call it, of called AMP-iframe for putting iframes in your page, and it will is basically the underlying technology for embedding many of these third-party comment systems into your page.
Great. So we've got a couple questions coming in via the Q&A app here. Again, if anybody on the call has questions, feel free to jump in and interrupt me. But in the meantime, I'll start cherry picking from the audience here. We got a question from Josh Parrish, and we got a few plus ones on that one. So it looks like a few other people are interested in this question as well. Any plans to expand AMP beyond news articles and blog post content? What about a product landing page, for example?
So yes, there are plans, and I think so. I would put a boundary, and that's kind of my only job as a tech lead. I would put a boundary on it. If you can build a whole app out of AMP, we've failed, because part of this is that it's actually simple. It's focusing on this very specific use case of content, and we really want to make that fast, and we want to make it easy to create content. And so many type of content beyond news articles fit into the scheme. So obviously, I mean, blogs are like the simplest one, recipes, and I think stuff like product landing pages will also fit, but it's definitely further ahead in our roadmap. So I think right now we really want to be focused on newsy content and really make that experience great, and then kind of go into more verticals after that.
Malte, would it be fair to say, as long as the page or the articles or leaf nodes on the site are following the AMP specs, it can be a travel site? It doesn't have to be necessarily a news publication that's using AMP files?
That's completely correct. It's just that, so in many of these, let's call them verticals, you have these things you want to do, and they might not necessarily be easy in AMP. So for example, if you wanted to have like a direct response advertising landing page, and you want to ask the person to submit their stuff. So AMP currently doesn't have form support. We have very limited stuff for like newsletters, but if that's like the main thing you want to do on the page, AMP's currently not great for that. And so that's something where we would like look at this use case and say, like, what are the things that we have to do to make that really easy, and then we'll do it. And basically, depending on what exactly you want to do, it might already all be covered. So it's hard to say in general, but we just, like, when determining what to do, we obviously have to have certain use cases in mind to prioritize what we do.
And maybe this is a related question. Do we have examples that we can show people or links that we can point people to of like really great use cases that are available that people are currently working on to give people an idea of kind of the scope of what's possible with this?
So I think there's not, or we don't like maintain this curated set of articles. The way we launched AMP was with a like real search demo because we wanted it to be for real, right? It's really easy to make like 5 pages that are awesome, right? We had the team just like really make them nice, and that just wasn't our strategy. Having said that, I think like it would be nice to do something like it. Maybe we'll do it in the future. I think the formal innovation hangout, which is I think the last one in the series with Rudy, that would be a good time also to discuss all these things you want to do with AMP, and he might like be able to share more vision than I can.
Definitely, and if people have examples of AMP pages that they've created and they want to share those with us, definitely reach out to us and let us know what's working. We'll definitely highlight those in future events. We got a question from Matthew Terenzio. Apologies if I butchered your last name. Where and when can we find some documentation about the Google Cache/CDN information, and maybe more broadly, what is a great resource for people to turn to with more technical questions and documentation?
I don't have a date, but it's coming soon. We're currently in the process of rolling out also kind of a way to, so there's 2 things in AMP. Either you make content or you have links. So Twitter has links, Pinterest has links, like your instant messaging platform has links, and so they want to be able to like kind of use the AMP cache, and they just say, is there an AMP version for this file? And so that's kind of something we're slowly rolling out. And I think if you have an interesting use case, like if that's something you want, if you have links, then right now the best thing is to talk to us directly, and we can figure stuff out. But like basically at some point in the future, I don't know yet, this documentation will be made available.
That's great. I've got 2 questions, one simple one and one a little bit more complicated. Christina S. asks, does my AMP page have to be HTTPS?
No. But so there's basically when served through this AMP cache that we just mentioned, we only use HTTPS for all resources, and the AMP cache proxies all your document, your images, and your fonts. So for these 3 resources, because we serve them through the proxy, they don't have to be HTTPS. So we are fine with fetching them over HTTP. Having said that, we recommend you use HTTPS. I think we're helping the ecosystem by mandating it for everything else, because, for example, your ads, your iframes, your videos, which we don't proxy, they all have to be served over HTTPS. And so I think that's great because HTTPS is the way to go, specifically for, like, if it's your video, you get to control it. If it's not your ad, you don't get to control it. So with AMP, we're kind of really pushing this entire ecosystem. I mean, it's already on the way. Like, so we're just taking advantage mostly of everyone being kind of ready right now to be HTTPS only across the board. But for your site, the answer is you can serve it over HTTP.
So highly recommended, but not required.
Yes.
Another question from Thomas Goring. Again, I apologize if I butchered his last name. When making AMPs for paginated content, would the rel equals next and prev point to the next/prev canonical link or the next/prev AMP link? This is kind of related to our previous question.
I think that was asked in the last hangout, but maybe not. So I think the answer is yes, but this is better answered by one of the webmaster consultants from Google. But I think, basically, I think the answer is yes.
Yeah, and I think we did actually answer this in the last office hour. For that particular question, if anybody's interested, definitely check out the previous office hour. And if that isn't answered in full there, we will be getting to this in future Hangouts as well. Thomas Hawk asks, he says, I downloaded AMP from GitHub. I unzipped the files to my local machine. The get started with AMP should take for example, article.amp within the examples directory and make it work with its corresponding subdirectories, such as 1 fonts 2 images? I guess the question is, should it work?
So, very specific question. First of all, there's the GitHub project, but you do not need to check it out yourself. Check out as in literal git checkout if you want to make AMP pages. So everything in the AMP documentation, which is on ampproject.org/docs, is enough to make documents, because the AMP JavaScript files are referenced over the internet. You don't have to download anything. So having said that, obviously, we really encourage people to help us build the GitHub project. So if you want to work on AMP, not with AMP, you need to check out the project on GitHub. And there's an examples directory, and the stuff in it points to our production endpoints. We did this so you, as a non-developer, could just copy-paste everything and it works, because it doesn't point to the local GitHub. So the magic is that if you run the gulp command, which is in the documentation for the local GitHub, it creates a second directory called examples.build. And in this directory, for every example, there's a file that's called like the example, but .max. It goes against the non-production JavaScript in our GitHub. And then there's a .min file of the same name that kind of points to the locally built production JavaScript. So that's kind of a hoop we make developers on AMP to jump through, so it's easier for non-developers.
That's great. Got two related questions to HTTPS. We have Oliver Kucha is asking, he says, why only support for HTTPS iframes? Are they really faster than non-HTTPS?
It has nothing to do with performance, although performance of HTTPS can be really good, specifically if you use HTTP 2.0, which is in practice only supported on HTTPS. But the reason is that AMP is designed to be embeddable into platforms. And if you look at all the larger platforms like Twitter and, for example, Facebook or Google, they all serve their pages on HTTPS. So only stuff that's on HTTPS can be embeddable. And because the AMP page itself is in HTTPS, every sub-resource has to be HTTPS, because if it wouldn't be, this kind of trust that is inherent to HTTPS goes away, because that iframe could be snooped on, could be man in the middle of all these bad things you can do in HTTP. So that's why we mandate that the entire tree of resources, everything that's referenced from the AMP document, has to be in HTTPS. And again, as a kind of a thing, that's only true for stuff like iframes. It's not true for images, font, and the document itself.
So this is really more of a security issue and just being consistent across all of your different elements within your site.
Right, you're right. It's a security thing, and because HTTPS, if you start on a root node, basically on the page, everything down the chain has to be HTTPS as well.
That's great. And I got a follow-up question from Oliver. He says, will AMP pages be listed in the news carousel even if the AMP HTML contains some errors, for example, has an iframe from a non-HTTPS link?
They won't be.
All right.
One of the, and literally, you click it and it won't work, right? So that would be not a good user experience, because the browser would say, I refuse to load this iframe because that would be bad for the user, because it might be intercepted by a hacker. So.
And in that case, you'd get a warning. You'd get some kind of a splash page that says that this page is not secure. Go back to safety or something along those lines.
Stuff like that, yeah.
Yeah.
For sub-resources, when the main page is secure, but in sub-resources not, browsers now tend to just block them, to not show them at all, which is obviously not a good experience.
Definitely. I got a question from Hill Web Creations. They say, do you have guidelines posted somewhere to help us deal with duplicate content issues when moving to HTTPS?
I mean, that's in the end kind of, in general, if you move to HTTPS, you shouldn't have duplicate content, because if you get rid of your HTTP URLs. And so, it's kind of the same question with respect to the canonical that we had earlier. I think with canonical URL should try to do everything right. Yeah.
That's great. This is a good question for Paul at WordPress. Is there much point in learning the technology behind AMP if WordPress is going to have plugins that do it automatically? Maybe this is a question for Malte and for Paul.
I would say it depends. If you're in the business of building websites, then I think you need to be familiar with AMP. If you're a blogger, small business, and you don't really care kind of how your website works under the hood, then use the plugin. Don't think twice about what's going on there.
And to kind of add to that, I think that's exactly right, and that's great. What I want to point out is that the philosophy of AMP is to not, well, I mean, I'm talking about all these restrictions, but the other side of the story is you get to do all these things. So you host the page yourself, you get to do all the things with CSS you can imagine, and so really like express the brand, your personality, and all these things. So you can definitely go deep in, for example, like maybe like in the WordPress case, customize your theme, or in the just in general, we really don't want all AMP pages to look the same, because that's not what the web is. The web is great and crazy and sometimes weird, and like all these things should happen in AMP.
Very good. Any other questions here from the members of the Hangout before we got about 10 more minutes left, and we got about another half a dozen questions from the comment section, but don't want to leave anybody out that's in the Hangout right now.
Hey guys, can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, hey, sorry, I had some issues with sound before, but this might be a basic question, and I apologize for this because I'm just catching up on AMP. You mentioned that Google will start sending traffic in February. Can you elaborate a little bit on this? And then also, second part question, are there other search engines and other social networks who are working on implementing this?
Answer the second question first. So launch partners are Twitter, Pinterest, and LinkedIn, and as far as I know, they all work on this. Definitely, I've seen Pinterest experimenting with AMP, so that's definitely going on. To answer the Google question, so what's going to happen is that starting in late February, Google will start basically let AMP pages that are, so right now if you have a canonical AMP page, so there's no equivalent, you can already show up in search because of course that's what you want, right? But if right now if you have a AMP page next to your normal web page, the AMP pages wouldn't actually show up in search. And so starting late February, that is going to change. So for a subset of content, and that's going to be, my understanding is mostly in the news realm, is basically Google will say, if there are these AMP documents, I'm going to send users to that, and then the users will get the instant experience and all that stuff. So that's what we mean, and so that's something that right now hasn't happened, and then basically that's what we're seeing with, in quotes, sending traffic, right? So Google will basically say, oh, there's an AMP version, and then through normal ranking determine, oh, it's a good idea to show it, and then give it as a search result.
All right, so Malte, we're going to do a quick lightning round here. These are yes or no questions with directions for people to find more information elsewhere, I think, on a lot of these. I got a quick question here from Dimitar Grablev. Are there any plans to support AdSense for shopping? I just wanted to mention that we do have a specific hangout around ads on February 19th with Craig DeNatale, but Malte, maybe you could quickly give a yes or no on that.
I don't know.
That works too.
There's no. I think yeah, Craig is right person to answer this.
Great.
We have support for AdSense in general, and maybe it probably will be easy to add.
Definitely.
File a GitHub issue.
Yep, and again, we will be covering this in more detail in future office hours. Another one, again, we're going to be talking about analytics coming up. I believe, what is that, February 5th? But we do have an analytics question here. Can you speak about analytics, specifically support for ComScore and Adobe Analytics? Will these be supported at launch?
I happen to know the answer for ComScore. Yes. For Adobe Analytics, they're one of our launch partners, but I'm not fully aware of their status right now.
So pending, check us back out at February 5th, and we'll be able to get into that in more detail. Hill Web Creations, another question. Excited about WordPress AMP plugin. How will it not load additional plugin weight? Good question.
It depends. We're still, I think, figuring out how plugins interact with each other. But I think what is likely to happen is that if you're using plugins that output stuff to the page that is not AMP formatted, then your pages will not validate.
I think that's a good answer. I got a couple other questions here. Christina S. She's got a question about AdSense. Christina, definitely check us out again on that, what is it, February 19th piece specifically around ads. We'll answer your question in more detail then. I got another question about analytics from Hill Web Creations. Definitely check us out February 5th with Rudy Galfi. I'll be talking a little bit more in detail about analytics there. I got another one by Terry Simmons about analytics and referring to Canonical. Terry, definitely join us back again on that AMP Hangout around analytics on February 5th, and we'll get into more detail there. William Harvey asks, are there any size quantity limitations with AMP, for example, CSS, HTML, and images? We answered this 2 sessions ago, but Malte, do you have a quick answer on that?
Yes, 50 kilobytes on CSS, no size limitation on HTML.
Great.
For images, that's actually something we might do in the future. We put some mitigations in place on the cache layer to avoid super large images. Please don't take a picture with your DSLR and upload them to the web page without making them smaller.
So no uploading full raw images. And
not a good idea, or even the full JPEGs. And the other, like, there's this, there's source sets, which are the right way to get responsive images that load the right dimensions depending on your screen size, because your phone isn't as big as your 31-inch screen. So those should not be the same image ideally, and that's what you use source set for. Everyone should use it.
Good point.
Great.
Another question, Liz Carrasco. Man, I'm sorry if that's not how you pronounce your last name. I'm really getting all the good ones today. In the last office hour, we heard that pages don't have to be AMP compliant to be in the AMP carousel if they are very fast. Can you quantify that? What does very fast mean, and will it depend on the vertical?
So my understanding is that for specifically the AMP carousel, and that's obviously, kind of answers the question. So the AMP carousel only contains AMP pages. And I can give a few reasons for this. So I talked today about pre-rendering. So because we want instant experience, you need to do pre-render, and that's not possible with regular web pages because it's not predictable how many resources they will use. And I think that's kind of the main thing about AMP. You can promise someone with high confidence it's going to be a good experience. So the carousel that's specifically marked as an AMP carousel will only contain AMP pages.
Right, and I don't remember 100% verbatim the wording of the last Hangout, but I thought we cleared up that you do need to follow all the AMP specs to show up in the AMP carousel, as Malte said. So you can have a really fast web page. That's great. That's still ultimately a great user experience, but it will not appear in the carousel. You can still show up in the search results.
Definitely, and we did cover that in the last session. Towards the last 10 minutes of that session, if you wanted to review that, it's on our Google Plus page, and you can definitely get more information about that. I'm not even going to try his last name. Michael W. Says, AMP seems focused on serving heavier pages more quickly, such as those with images. Are there any benefits to text-based publishers to implement AMP, for example, education, academics, law, economics, business, research, and so on?
So, the AMP is really designed to speed up realistic web pages you find on the internet, and the pure text page is rare, I would say. In those verticals that were just named, there's like graphs and all these things, and you want to have analytics, and you want to have, if you're advertising, finance, you'll have ads, and so all these things mixed together. Typically, like, there's few trivial web pages. So I think there's little to gain for a trivial web page, but I'd argue that they're pretty rare.
Yeah, and actually just a shameless plug for our g.co/newslab site too. If you have any one of those verticals that you're working within and you're finding yourself to be a very text-heavy website, there's a lot of opportunities to use things like mapping, graphs, charts, trends data, and other types of information to really flesh those out in more detail. And obviously photos are always really popular too. Another quick question here by Hill Web Creations. Thank you again, Hill Web, for sending all these really great questions today. We appreciate it. Should we be using Google Minify resources to get our CSS in shape for AMP pages?
Yes.
Excellent. And Ashley Berman Hale asks, does AMP work with push state bracket pages?
I don't understand the question, unfortunately. So we use push state. I just don't understand what the actual question is.
I don't exactly. This goes just slightly above my knowledge set. So Ashley, if you do have a follow-up question to this, or you can redefine it in the next 30 seconds or so, jump in there and we'll answer it. Otherwise, follow us on Twitter or Google+, and we'll answer your question there. Simon Perry said that he missed a point. Unfortunately, Simon, I don't know which point you were referring to specifically, so if you did miss any of the answers, and this actually ties into HillWeb's most recent question about where to view the Hangouts after the event. If any of this information is interesting to you and you just maybe we went too quickly or you want to go back through it again, you can find all of this stuff on our YouTube page. It is youtube.com/newslab@Google. This office hour and all of the office hours will be on that page, as well as our Google Plus page. One last question from John Petit. He says, can you explain how communication about pre-render works? How does a viewer tell an AMP page it's in pre-render and then tell that it's no longer in pre-render, so it loads all of the third-party stuff?
So the way this is technically implemented is that the pre-rendering itself is done by loading the page in an iframe, and a fragment URL, so the stuff being hashed in the URL, is used to pass information to that page. And from that moment on, there's a post-message-based channel between the container that knows whether pre-render is over and the pre-render page. That's how they communicate. In the open source repository, there's the examples directory. There's a file called, I think, viewer-integration.html that's kind of showing how this is done. And it's also on our agenda, like long backlog of things we want to do is to kind of publish this as a standardized API. But the examples already show how it's being done.
That's great. And we have one last question, and then I'm going to turn it over to the Hangout, and then we're going to wrap up because we're out of time. Josh Parrish asks, can you talk a little bit about schema.org and AMP? My page validates without it, but Google Search Console throws an error if schema is missing. What's up with that?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think the Search Console should qualify slightly, and I think they're working on this, what this actually means. So AMP in itself doesn't have an opinion about how you mark your page or schema.org. We really think schema.org is a great idea. So it's like OGP from Facebook and Twitter cards, all these things. You should definitely use them because they're really important for your social media presence. And so basically, the answer is Google for the AMP carousel requires you to put schema.org. So it's a Google-specific requirement, and Search Console obviously is a Google-specific tool. So that's why it's having this requirement.
That's great. And any last questions from anybody in the audience here, or from the Hangout?
I have a quick comment that'll lead to a question from Malte. So this is really helpful for someone who used to have her own news site, even though it was very technical. I think how I'm envisioning this is there are definitely more of guidelines that the ultimate decision process for whether or not a page should be AMP is still very much an editorial process. You get to decide which pages should be AMP HTML and which ones should still be your canonical pages. So Malte, is it right to say an entire site doesn't have to be AMP or not? It doesn't have to be all or nothing?
Yeah, it's definitely not all or nothing. So we expect most publishers will, for now, have AMP and non-AMP versions of their pages. That's not completely what we kind of what we would say is the right way to do it in the long term, but for now, that's definitely the right way to do it. So you get to make a decision on a page-by-page basis. I'm really excited about future models in the realm of what we call progressive web apps that'll both use AMP and go beyond that for better user experience. But I think what you say is definitely right for now, that you can make a decision on a page-by-page basis.
All right. Any last questions from our Hangout participants?
Hi, I have a quick question. For video content that's embedded in articles, are there any complications with that in terms of how it'll play, how it'll load into the page? Is there like a minimum or maximum size? That would be helpful.
So there's various possibilities to load video. There's an AMP video tag, that does what it says. When it's basically, it maps one-to-one to the video tag in HTML5. So it comes with a limitation that it doesn't have like advertising support baked in, stuff like that. So, but if you just have a basic video, that's what you want to use. There is, for example, for Brightcove, many publishers use that. There's dedicated support. Obviously YouTube, and we're working on Vimeo and all these other platforms will get dedicated support. What we recommend, if you have many publishing houses have like their super complicated video player, you can continue to use it with AMP. That's what AMP-iframe is for. Works really well with most video players. The thing with all these video options is they have to be HTTPS.
All right. Any other last questions? All right. Well, again, just wanted to thank everybody for joining us today. These are all really, really useful questions, and definitely helps a lot of people figure out more about AMP and how to better implement AMP. I just wanted to give another quick shout out for our site, g.co/newslab. You can find links to our Google Plus page, to our YouTube page, to our Twitter account, and all those tutorials that I was mentioning earlier on this site. Definitely worth checking out if you haven't already. For those of you who have joined the Hangout, again, thank you for joining and asking your questions. We'll be sending links around to all of the URLs that we mentioned in this event in the Google Plus event page, as well as the YouTube page. For anyone who wasn't able to get their questions answered, or if they wanted more information and wanted to follow up, definitely check us out on our YouTube page where this will be hosted, and check us out next week, which will be...
We've got product manager Rudy Galfi covering analytics, and there are lots of analytics questions, so stay tuned the exact same time next week.
That's right, 9 a.m. Pacific time. Thank you, everybody, and have yourselves a wonderful weekend.
Thanks, everyone.